Welcome to the History Maps podcast. In 1791, an indigenous coalition handed the United States Army the worst defeat in its entire history.
Right, and it is something that people rarely talk about.
Yeah, we are not talking about Custer at Little Bighorn here. We are looking at a battle near the Wabash River where a quarter of the entire United States military was wiped out in a single morning.
A quarter of the military,
Right.
just, gone.
Yeah. General Arthur St. Clair lost hundreds of men to a highly organized, tactically superior pan-tribal force. Yet, if you open a standard history book, that event is often just like a mere footnote.
Well, I mean, we have this tendency to view military history like a clean X-ray.
Oh, I see what you mean.
You want to see the clear fracture, the solid dividing line between Nation A and Nation B, and point to a specific year to say that is where the war started, and that is where it ended.
Right. It is a very comforting binary framework. We are sort of conditioned to expect these clean narratives with clear winners, defined battlefields, and formal declarations of war.
But when you step into the historical landscape of the American Indian Wars, that X-ray machine just shatters. We are looking at a historical reality that defines muddy waters.
So true. The sources we are looking at for this deep dive cover local, regional, and continental conflicts stretching from the early 1600s well into the 1920s.
It is a vast timeline.
It really is. And our mission today is to unravel this complex history for you objectively. We are going to examine the demographic, military, and cultural mechanics of these conflicts without taking political sides.
Yeah, to really understand the scope, we have to discard the idea of a single unified war. We are analyzing centuries of friction involving diverse indigenous North American nations, various European colonial powers, and eventually, the expanding United States.
Because the driving forces were constantly shifting, right? It was a mix of competition for resources, broken diplomatic agreements, and these really complex political alliances.
Precisely. Let's start in the early 1600s.
Okay, let's do it.
The traditional story usually paints European settlers arriving and immediately fighting a unified indigenous population. But the sources show us something entirely different.
Yeah, they show intense proxy wars. It feels less like a simple conquest and much more like a brutal corporate arms race or a Cold War proxy conflict.
That corporate arms race analogy is highly accurate. I mean, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the English, Spanish, French, Dutch, and Russians were all vying for economic dominance in North America.
Right.
And the Native American tribes functioned as independent sovereign nations with their own complex foreign policies. They were not just a monolith waiting to be conquered.
So how did those early alliances actually work mechanically? Were the tribes just picking sides based on who they liked better?
Not at all. It was driven by strict economic survival. Consider the Beaver Wars, which ran from roughly 1609 to 1701.
Which is almost a century of conflict.
Yeah, and it was fundamentally an economic conflict over the fur trade.
Yeah.
European markets had an insatiable demand for beaver pelts.
For the fashion industry over there.
Yeah, mostly for felt hats. And indigenous nations traded those pelts for European goods.
Specifically firearms, right? Because once one tribe gets European muskets, the entire balance of power shifts.
Precisely. The introduction of firearms created an immediate arms race. If your neighboring tribe acquired Dutch muskets, you needed French muskets, or your nation would face annihilation.
It is a literal adapt or die scenario.
It was. So the Iroquois Confederacy sought to monopolize the fur trade to ensure their continuous access to these European goods. Because the beaver population in their home territory was becoming depleted, they needed to expand westward.
Which means pushing into the territory of other tribes.
Yes. The Iroquois allied with the English and the Dutch to secure weapons, and they launched devastating campaigns against the Algonquian-speaking tribes who were allied with the French.
So the indigenous nations utilized the European powers for access to global markets and military technology,
Right.
while the Europeans utilized the indigenous nations as proxy armies to bleed their colonial rivals dry without committing their own regular troops.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it. It was a very pragmatic relationship on both sides.
We see that same economic friction driving conflicts on the eastern seaboard, too. Like in Virginia, you have the Anglo-Powhatan Wars spanning from 1610 to 1646.
Right.
And up in New England, there is King Philip's War in 1675. These were not grand ideological crusades. They were deeply rooted in local disputes over land use, severe trade imbalances, and the rapid influx of settlers disrupting established indigenous economies.
King Philip's War is a really prime example of systemic economic collapse leading to violence. The indigenous leader Metacom known to the English as King Philip, saw his people's sovereignty eroding.
Because the English settlers were constantly expanding their agricultural footprint.
Yeah, which destroyed indigenous hunting grounds. Furthermore, the English forced the indigenous populations into debt traps through unequal trade agreements. The war was a desperate attempt to reset the economic and territorial balance.
And the indigenous nations adapted to the multipolar European presence. During the French and Indian War in the mid-18th century, Native American tribes fought on both sides.
They did.
They aligned with whichever colonial power offered the most favorable trade relations and territorial protections at that specific moment.
It was sophisticated diplomacy. The tribes understood that as long as multiple European powers were competing on the continent, the indigenous nations held leverage.
They could play the French against the British or the Spanish against the French to negotiate better terms.
Exactly. And this violent scramble for resources was happening on every edge of the continent, completely disconnected from the British and French dynamics.
Right, like in Alaska.
Yeah. In 1784, Russian colonists in Alaska perpetrated the Awanka massacre against the Koniag-Alutiiq people.
The Russian expansion there was driven entirely by the maritime fur trade, specifically sea otters, right?
Yes. And when the Alutiiq people resisted the forced labor and resource extraction imposed by the Russian fur traders, the Russians responded with overwhelming violence.
The sources note that between 200 and 3,000 Alutiiq individuals were killed on Sikhaldak Island.
It is a devastating event. It demonstrates that wherever global economic demands intersected with indigenous resources, severe conflict followed.
But that multipolar dynamic, that ability to play different empires against each other, starts to completely collapse in the late 18th century.
Right.
The American Revolution fundamentally rewrites the geopolitical rules of the continent.
The conclusion of the American Revolutionary War in 1783 is the critical turning point. Before the Revolution, the British, French, and Spanish balanced each other.
They kept each other in check.
Yeah. But once the United States secures its independence, the conflict shifts. It evolves from a multipolar proxy struggle into a direct, existential contest over the lands east of the Mississippi River.
We often view the American Revolution strictly as a rebellion against King George. But in the West, it was a parallel Indian War.
The newly formed United States was competing directly with the British for control of the territory east of the Mississippi. Many indigenous nations recognized that the aggressive agricultural expansion of the American settlers posed a far greater threat than the British imperial presence, which was primarily focused on trade.
So that is why many tribes allied with the British.
Precisely.
But that dynamic forced incredibly difficult internal decisions within the tribes. I'm looking at the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a deeply established, powerful political union in New York and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the revolution actually broke their council fire.
That is profound.
It really is. The Iroquois Confederacy operated on consensus, but the American Revolution presented an impossible choice. The Oneida and Tuscarora nations decided to side with the American patriots, largely due to the influence of specific missionaries and trade relationships.
Okay.
Conversely, the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga nations aligned with the British. The revolution forced intra-Iroquois combat, shattering centuries of political unity.
And the devastating part is that regardless of which side they chose, they all lost.
Yeah, they really did.
When the British signed the 1783 Treaty of Paris to end the war, they ceded an enormous amount of indigenous territory to the United States.
They did so without consulting any of their native allies. From the perspective of the new United States government, the tribes who had allied with the British were classified as conquered enemy combatants who had forfeited their land rights.
Even though the tribes themselves had not been defeated.
Right. But this presumption of conquest by the U.S. set the stage for decades of continuous, brutal frontier conflict.
Which leads directly to the Cherokee-American Wars and the resistance of Dragging Canoe. We are looking at almost nonstop fighting from 1776 through 1794.
Yeah. Dragging Canoe led a faction known as the Chickamauga Cherokee. He recognized that appeasement was failing, so he formed a coalition drawing in Muskogee warriors, Shawnee fighters, and even runaway slaves.
Dragging Canoe's strategy was highly sophisticated. He utilized the rugged terrain of the Tennessee River Valley to launch campaigns ranging from swift, localized raids to huge coordinated attacks involving over 1,000 warriors.
His goal was to make the cost of American settlement in Tennessee and Kentucky too high to sustain.
And his resistance in the South was frequently coordinated with indigenous efforts further north. Which brings us back to that monumental defeat we mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
In the Northwest Territory, which is modern-day Ohio and Indiana.
Right, a powerful pan-tribal confederacy formed, including the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Ottawa.
This confederacy was determined to hold the line at the Ohio River. When the United States sent military expeditions to crush them, the Confederacy demonstrated exceptional tactical discipline.
This is General St. Clair's defeat in 1791.
Yeah. It occurred because the indigenous commanders, including Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, executed a perfect crescent-shaped ambush.
I want to break down the mechanics of that battle because the casualty rate is just staggering.
It really is.
The Confederacy forces surrounded St. Clair's camp before dawn. They utilized the natural cover of the forest to completely neutralize the American artillery.
Which was a major tactical advantage for the Americans, usually.
Usually, yes. But here, when the American militia broke and ran, it caused absolute panic among the regular troops. Out of roughly 1,000 American soldiers, over 600 were killed and hundreds more wounded.
It was a catastrophic loss that forced the federal government to completely reorganize its military. The Confederacy's success forced the United States to build the Legion of the United States under General Anthony Wayne.
Which was a highly trained, disciplined force designed specifically for frontier warfare.
Right. And Wayne ultimately breaks the Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794.
The indigenous forces had positioned themselves behind a large swath of trees that had been knocked down by a tornado, using the timber as a natural breastwork.
Very smart positioning.
But Wayne's forces executed a disciplined bayonet charge that routed the defenders. The resulting Treaty of Greenville forced the cessation of vast tracts of Ohio and Indiana.
But the underlying pressure of American expansion did not stop.
It never did.
No, which catalyzed another pan-tribal movement by the early 1800s. This was organized by the Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother, the religious prophet Tenskwatawa.
Tecumseh's vision is really fascinating. He traveled from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Deep South, arguing that no single tribe had the right to sell land because the land belonged to all indigenous people collectively.
Yeah, he was trying to build a unified nation to physically halt the United States.
And his movement became deeply intertwined with the geopolitical tensions leading up to the War of 1812.
British officials in Canada began heavily supplying weapons to Tecumseh's Confederacy. The British government officially adopted a strategy to demand the creation of an independent Indian buffer state in the Ohio-Wisconsin area.
They argued this state would permanently separate the United States from British Canada.
I have to pause here and look at the British motivations. Were the British genuinely advocating for indigenous sovereignty? I mean, did they view Tecumseh as a head of state? Or was this just a convenient way to use indigenous lives as a geopolitical speed bump?
The historical evidence points heavily towards strategic self-interest. While individual British officers on the ground may have felt loyalty to their indigenous allies, the policymakers in London view the Confederacy merely as a tool to drain American resources.
Wow, I see.
When Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, the military backbone of the Confederacy broke.
And how did the British react at the peace table after the war?
When the British and Americans negotiated the Treaty of Ghent to end the war in 1812, the British initially demanded the buffer state. But the moment the Americans refused, the British abandoned the demand entirely.
Just dropped it.
Completely. They secured their own borders and left the indigenous nations to face the expanding United States alone. So the multipolar leverage is gone. The military resistance in the North has been fractured. And this ushers in the federal policies of the 1830s, specifically the Indian Removal Act of 1830 pushed by President Andrew Jackson.
The Removal Act represented a fundamental shift. The federal policy crystallized around a single goal: forcing the tribes living east of the Mississippi River to relocate to designated Indian territory in the West, primarily modern-day Oklahoma.
The legislation itself didn't explicitly authorize violent forced marches, right?
No, technically it was supposed to be negotiated.
But the application of the law resulted in the Trail of Tears, where tens of thousands of Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw people were forced from their ancestral lands, suffering horrific mortality rates from disease and exposure.
While the majority of tribes in the North and Southeast were forced westward, some factions chose a different path. In the Deep South, utilizing the dense, impenetrable terrain of the Florida Peninsula, resistance factions fought the longest and most financially costly wars the United States Army would ever wage against indigenous peoples.
The Seminole Wars. The dynamic here shifts the mechanics of the conflict entirely.
It really does.
We are looking at resistance to the Indian Removal Act, But the demographic makeup of the Seminoles makes this unique. You have leaders like Osceola, Maconape, and Arapaca, but you also have a significant population of runaway slaves integrated into their communities.
The presence of black Seminoles fundamentally altered the U.S. government's urgency. Enslaved individuals from plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas frequently escaped southward into Spanish Florida and later U.S.-controlled Florida, finding refuge within Seminole networks.
And the Seminoles provided autonomy.
Yes, and in return, the escaped slaves provided agricultural expertise and served as fiercely loyal warriors, knowing perfectly well what capture meant for them.
How much did that specific element, the fear of a slave sanctuary, change the military strategy? Did it shift the goal from simply clearing land for white settlers to something more punitive?
Oh, it transformed the entire nature of the conflict. For the Southern plantation economy, a thriving armed community of escaped slaves living just across the border was an existential threat.
Because it could inspire others.
Exactly. It served as a beacon that could inspire broader slave rebellions. Therefore, the U.S. government and local militias treated the Seminole Wars not just as a territorial dispute, but as a critical mission to dismantle a sanctuary for runaway slaves and return human property to plantation owners.
And the military engagements themselves were grueling. Let's look at the Dade Battle on December 28, 1835.
Okay.
The U.S. Army dispatches 110 men under Major Francis L. Dade to reinforce Fort King.
The Seminole leadership had excellent intelligence. They shadowed Major Dade's column for 5 days, waiting for the troops to reach a specific area where the pine barricades and palmetto scrub provided perfect cover.
And when the Seminoles launched their ambush, it was devastating.
Yeah.
The sensory details of this ambush explain why the Seminoles were so effective. The soldiers are marching in the open. Suddenly, the tree line erupts. Out of 110 American soldiers, only 3 survived the initial attack.
And one of those survivors is hunted down the next day.
Right. The Seminoles wiped out an entire command while suffering only 3 dead themselves.
And the coordination was remarkable. On that exact same day, miles away, Osceola led a war party that assassinated the federal Indian agent Wiley Thompson right outside the walls of Fort King.
The Seminoles were executing precise, decentralized strikes that completely paralyzed the U.S. military apparatus in Florida.
Because the U.S. military is trained to fight in formations, right?
Yes. They want to line up in a field and fire volleys. How do you do that in a swamp?
You cannot. The Battle of Lake Okeechobee on December 25, 1837, illustrates the tactical nightmare the U.S. Army faced. Colonel Zachary Taylor led roughly 1,000 men against Seminole fighters commanded by leaders known as Alligator and Sam Jones.
And the Seminoles deliberately chose a defensive position in a dense hammock surrounded by a half-mile of thick mud and razor-sharp sawgrass.
And Taylor orders a direct frontal assault. His men are wading through waist-deep muck.
The sawgrass is physically shredding their uniforms and skin, their powder is getting wet, and the Seminoles are firing from the elevated tree line, specifically targeting the officers.
The command structure of the U.S. force was decimated. Every single officer but one in the 6th Infantry was killed or wounded.
That is intense.
The soldiers suffered 26 dead and over 100 wounded, while the Seminoles lost only 11 men and successfully retreated deeper into the Everglades.
The terrain neutralized everything. The U.S. Army's superiority in numbers, their artillery, their supply chains, none of it mattered in the deep swamp. It forced a brutal war of attrition.
The financial and human cost to the federal government was unprecedented. The U.S. Army officially recorded over 1,400 deaths.
Wow. That is a huge number.
Yeah, though the vast majority succumbed to tropical diseases rather than combat wounds. By 1842, the war slowly ground to a halt.
While the military successfully captured and deported thousands of Seminoles to Indian Territory, they never achieved total victory. A core group of Seminoles remained deep in the Everglades, never signing a formal peace treaty.
As the U.S. government gradually consolidated control over the eastern states through these removals, American expansion continued pressing westward.
And this brings us to a region where the standard narrative of settlers pushing back local tribes completely fails to capture the reality on the ground. We need to talk about the Texas frontier.
To understand the conflicts in Texas, we must recognize that the American settlers were not entering an empty wilderness.
Right.
Nor were they facing fragmented defensive tribes. They were colliding head-on with an established, highly sophisticated imperial power.
You are referring to the Comanche. I want to unpack this because calling the Comanche an empire changes how we view the entire conflict. How exactly did they function as an empire?
We use the term proto-empire to describe Comancheria because it was a massive, active socioeconomic system that dictated the geopolitics of the southern plains. They controlled a territory larger than many European nations.
They were a superpower.
Absolutely. In the 1750s, the Comanche military machine had actually halted the northward expansion of the Spanish Empire, inflicting decisive defeats that forced the Spanish to remain south of the Rio Grande.
They dictated the borders of European empires. And they fueled this power through a highly complex economic supply chain based on the horse trade and captive taking.
Precisely. The Comanche economy relied on raiding deep into northern Mexico. They would extract thousands of horses and take human captives.
And they integrated these captives into their society to bolster their population.
Yes, and they traded the horses northward to other tribes and even to American merchants. They controlled the flow of commerce and military power across the plains.
So when American settlers begin pouring into Texas in the 1830s, they are essentially trespassing on the economic hub of a regional superpower.
The collision was instantaneous and incredibly violent. A defining moment was the Fort Parker incident in 1836. A coalition of Comanches, Kiowas, and their allies attacked a Texan settlement, killing several people and taking captives.
Among those taken was a young girl named Cynthia Ann Parker.
Right.
Her abduction becomes a major political rallying cry in Texas. The Republic of Texas is struggling to figure out how to handle the Comanche threat. You have President Sam Houston, who understood indigenous diplomacy because he had lived with the Cherokees. He tries to negotiate treaties to establish formal boundaries.
But Houston's diplomatic approach is entirely overturned by his successor, Mirabeau B. Lamar.
Lamar had a very different view.
Very different. Lamar viewed this situation as an absolute racial and territorial war. He instituted a policy demanding the complete expulsion or destruction of the Comanches and Kiowas within Texas borders.
Which leads to diplomatic disasters like the Council House fight in 1840.
Yeah.
The Comanches arrive in San Antonio for a peace parley. They intend to negotiate the ransom of captives, which was a standard diplomatic practice for them.
But the Texas militia had no intention of negotiating. They attempted to take the Comanche peace chiefs hostage inside the meeting house to force the release of all white captives.
The Comanches, viewing this as an ultimate betrayal of diplomatic protocol, fought back. The militia killed 33 Comanche leaders and warriors in the resulting shootout.
From the Comanche perspective, killing ambassadors at a peace parley is unforgivable. Their response was the Great Bog of 1840.
They mobilized hundreds of warriors, swept completely across the Texas plains all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, sacked the towns of Victoria and Linville, and returned to the plains driving thousands of stolen horses.
It was an enormous demonstration of state power.
And this back-and-forth violence defined the Texas frontier for decades. The story of Cynthia Ann Parker perfectly encapsulates this era. She was fully assimilated into Comanche society. She married a prominent war chief, Pito Nocona, and had children.
In 1860, Texas Rangers attacked her camp and recaptured her.
She is returned to her white family, but she never reassimilates. She spends the rest of her life trying to escape back to the Comanches. And her son, Quanah Parker, grows up to become one of the most formidable Comanche leaders of the final era.
Quanah Parker represents the tragic arc of Comancheria. He led the resistance during the Red River War. At the Second Battle of Adobe Walls in 1874, he led a large coalition of warriors against a group of American buffalo hunters.
Why specifically target the buffalo hunters?
Because the hunters were systematically destroying the foundational resource of the Comanche economy. Commercial hunters were slaughtering millions of bison solely for their hides, leaving the meat to rot.
That is just so wasteful.
It was devastating. Without the bison, the Comanche could not feed their people, make their shelters, or sustain their independence. Quanah Parker fought until the combined pressure of military campaigns and absolute starvation forced his band to surrender and relocate to a reservation in 1875.
So in the South, the conflicts are driven by this collision of expanding empires and agricultural settlement. But if we shift our focus to the Pacific Northwest and the mountainous regions, the catalyst changes overnight.
It does.
We are no longer just talking about land for farming. We are talking about precious metals.
The discovery of gold fundamentally altered the timeline of conflict. The Oregon Trail had already brought a steady stream of settlers, but the regional gold rushes of the 1850s and 60s injected a sudden, uncontrollable surge of prospectors into areas without any regard for established indigenous boundaries.
I want to focus on the legal mechanics here. The territorial governors in places like Washington, such as Isaac Stevens, rush out to negotiate treaties. They tell the tribes, sign this paper, cede this large amount of land, and we will guarantee you a smaller reservation that will be protected forever.
Those negotiations were heavily coerced. The indigenous leaders often signed to avoid immediate military destruction, but the reservations they were given were frequently on poor agricultural land, severing their access to traditional fishing and hunting grounds.
But here is the critical contradiction in federal policy. Why did the United States continually negotiate these treaties if they lacked the ability or even the desire to stop gold miners from trespassing the moment a treaty was signed?
It highlights the dual nature of federal policy. The treaty served a legal purpose in Washington, D.C. They created a facade of orderly, lawful expansion.
Right. It looked good on paper.
Yeah, but on the ground, the federal government simply did not have the military manpower to police thousands of miles of frontier. Moreover, the economic lure of gold was too powerful. The political will to use the U.S. Army to arrest white American citizens for trespassing on native land did not exist.
The economic imperatives of resource extraction always superseded diplomatic obligations,
Always.
which means the indigenous populations were constantly forced into defensive postures. When miners trespassed, destroyed the local environment, and committed violence, the tribes retaliated.
This sparks the Cayuse War after the Whitman Massacre in 1847, and later the Yakima War and the Puget Sound War.
During the Puget Sound War, we see how the legal system was weaponized. Chief Leshy of the Nisqually tribe recognized that the Treaty of Medicine Creek placed his people on land where they could not survive.
So he engaged in armed resistance.
And the territorial government eventually captured him, tried him in a civilian court, and hanged him for murder in 1858.
But his story has a modern legal coda. In 2004, a historical court convened by the state of Washington formally exonerated Chief Leshy.
The court acknowledged that he was a lawful combatant operating during a declared state of war, and therefore the charge of murder was legally invalid.
It shows how the legal judgments of the era were deeply flawed.
In addition to the violence of miners and militias, the Pacific Northwest suffered unimaginable devastation from disease. The 1862 Pacific Northwest smallpox epidemic wiped out enormous percentages of the indigenous populations from Washington state up through British Columbia.
The sources reveal a deeply disturbing aspect of this epidemic. During the Chilcotin War of 1864 in British Columbia, colonial road builders were trying to push through Selk'nam territory.
And the Silcotin oral history maintained that the road crews intentionally threatened them with smallpox to break their resistance.
The concept of disease as an intentional weapon of colonization is a heavy subject, but the historical record demands we examine it. This was not merely an indigenous rumor.
In 2014, the provincial government of British Columbia issued a formal apology.
Yes, acknowledging indications that smallpox was spread intentionally to decimate the indigenous population and end their sovereignty over the land.
When you combine the pressure of disease, the constant influx of miners, and the systemic failure of treaties, it forces indigenous groups into horrific situations. The Nez Perce War of 1877 is a prime example.
The Nez Perce had historically maintained peaceful relations with the United States, but a gold rush in Idaho led the government to demand they relocate to a reservation roughly one-tenth the size of their treaty lands.
A faction led by Chief Joseph and other leaders refused.
They decided their only option was to flee to Canada.
And the logistics of what they accomplished are just staggering. You have a band of about 800 Nez Perce, the majority being women, children, and the elderly. They conduct a fighting retreat covering 1,200 miles across the Rocky Mountains.
Over the course of 4 months, this highly mobile civilian camp outmaneuvered and engaged over 2,000 U.S. soldiers. They fought 18 different engagements, including 4 major battles.
The tactical brilliance of the Nez Perce commanders allowed them to hold off a modernized military force until the sheer exhaustion, freezing temperatures, and the lack of supplies forced their surrender just 40 miles short of the Canadian border.
It is a devastating testament to human endurance.
And as we transition from the mountains to the Great Plains, we see the U.S. military arrive with a hardened, ruthless methodology. The conflicts on the plains are the most famous, but to understand them, we have to look at how the American Civil War fundamentally rewired the military apparatus.
When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the federal government withdrew the professional, regular army units from the western frontier to fight the Confederacy in the east. To secure the frontier, territorial governments raised local volunteer militias.
And these local militias operated with a completely different mindset than the regular army. A professional soldier might view their posting as a job, but a local militia member views the indigenous population as a direct competitor for the land they want to live on.
That local friction resulted in extreme violence. We see this in the Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota. The Dakota Sioux had signed treaties, but the federal government failed to deliver the promised annuities and food supplies.
Facing winter starvation, Dakota factions launched attacks on settlements. The militia response was rapid and punitive.
After the militia suppressed the uprising, they convened military tribunals. They processed hundreds of cases a day, sentencing over 300 Dakota warriors to death in trials that often lasted less than 5 minutes.
Trials of 5 minutes.
Yeah, it was barely a legal process. President Abraham Lincoln reviewed the transcripts and commuted the sentences of those who had only participated in battles, leaving the death sentences for those convicted of killing civilians.
On December 26, 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged simultaneously in Mankato, Minnesota. It remains the largest penal mass execution in United States history.
That punitive, localized militia approach leads directly to the horror of the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. It is November 29th, 1864.
The territorial governor has basically issued a shoot-on-sight order, but you have a peaceful encampment of Cheyenne and Arapaho led by Chief Black Kettle.
Black Kettle had actively sought peace. He had traveled to Denver for negotiations and was told to camp at Sand Creek, flying an American flag and a white flag above his lodge to signal their peaceful status.
But the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, commanded by Colonel John Chivington, ignored those flags. They attacked the camp at dawn.
The militia killed around 200 people, the vast majority being women, children, and the elderly.
The soldiers then systematically mutilated the bodies. The brutality of Sand Creek shattered any illusion of peace on the plains.
It completely discredited the peace chiefs like Black Kettle. Younger, highly militarized factions within the tribes, such as the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, took control of the narrative.
Let's explain the Dog Soldiers because they're not just an army unit, they're a distinct social and political force.
Correct. Within Plains Indian societies, there were various warrior societies. The Dog Soldiers were one of the most prominent among the Cheyenne. They operated independently of the traditional Council of Chiefs.
So they didn't have to listen to the peace chiefs.
Right. After Sand Creek, they argued that negotiating with the United States was suicidal, and they launched violent retributive raids across Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska, effectively shutting down overland routes.
This highlights a profound contradiction in U.S. policy. You have federal commissioners from Washington traveling west to sign treaties, promising peace and annuities.
Yeah.
But simultaneously, you have local militia commanders operating under extermination orders. If I am an indigenous leader, how am I supposed to navigate that?
You cannot navigate it safely. The disjointed nature of the U.S. response created a landscape of absolute mistrust. A treaty signed by a federal agent offered zero protection if a local militia commander decided to clear a valley for settlement.
When the Civil War ends, the regular army returns to the plains. And they bring back generals like William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan, men who had just spent years executing total war against the Confederacy.
Sheridan is given command of the region, and he changes the tactical doctrine entirely. He recognized a fundamental truth about fighting on the Great Plains.
What was that?
During the summer, the indigenous tribes were highly mobile. Their vast horse herds had plenty of grass, and they could easily outmaneuver heavy cavalry columns.
But in the winter, the tribes were static. They had to camp in protected river valleys and rely on stored food supplies to survive the brutal weather.
So Sheridan weaponizes the winter. He realizes he doesn't need to defeat them in open combat. He just needs to destroy their logistics.
This is the doctrine of total war applied to the frontier. In the winter of 1868, Sheridan launches a campaign designed to strike the tribes when they are most vulnerable.
He dispatches Lieutenant Colonel George Custer and the 7th Cavalry into the field in late November.
Custer tracks a group to a camp on the Washita River. And tragically, it is Black Kettle's camp, the same leader who survived Sand Creek.
Custer attacks at dawn. They kill an estimated 100 Native Americans. But the most significant tactical action of the Battle of Washita River happens after the shooting stops.
Custer orders his men to slaughter the camp's pony herd.
They shot 675 horses. They also burned the winter clothing, the tippis, and the dried meat.
By destroying their transportation and their food stores at the onset of winter, the military ensured the survivors would face starvation.
This strategy crippled the economic and logistical foundation of the Plains tribes, forcing many to report to the reservations simply to keep their families from freezing to death.
This relentless pressure over resources culminates in the Great Sioux War of 1876. And once again, the catalyst is gold.
The federal government had signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, guaranteeing the Black Hills to the Lakota Sioux. But when an expedition confirms gold in the hills, prospectors flood the area in violation of the treaty.
The federal government initially attempts to purchase the Black Hills, but the Lakota refuse to sell land they considered deeply sacred.
Faced with political pressure from mining interests, the government issues an ultimatum. All Lakota must report to the reservations by January 31st, 1876.
When many bands, understandably, do not comply in the dead of winter, the military is sent to force them in.
Which leads to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Custer and the 7th Cavalry are scouting ahead of a larger column. They locate an enormous encampment along the Little Bighorn River, containing thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho.
The encampment includes formidable leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull.
Custer severely underestimates the size and tactical readiness of the camp. He divides his regiment into 3 battalions to surround the village.
But the indigenous forces counterattack with overwhelming numbers and superior firepower. They isolate Custer's specific detachment and annihilate it completely.
The destruction of Custer's command sends shockwaves through the United States, especially since the news arrives on the East Coast, right as the nation is celebrating its centennial in 1876.
But while it was a monumental tactical victory for the Plains tribes, it provoked a massive strategic response.
The federal government flooded the region with troops. They relentlessly pursued the dispersed bands throughout the following year.
Starving, exhausted, and constantly harassed by the military, the major resistance leaders were eventually forced to surrender.
The traditional historical narrative usually draws a line under the winter of 1890, pointing to the horrific events at Wounded Knee as the definitive end of the Indian Wars.
Let's discuss Wounded Knee. On December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry intercepted a band of Minneconjou Lakota led by Spotted Elk near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota.
The Lakota were exhausted and freezing. They had been participating in the ghost dance.
We need to explain the ghost dance because it wasn't a war dance. It was a religious revitalization movement born out of absolute desperation.
Exactly. The movement was founded by a Paiute prophet named Wovoka. The core belief was that if the indigenous people performed this specific dance and lived peacefully, the earth would renew itself.
The white settlers would disappear, and the massive herds of buffalo would return. It was a spiritual coping mechanism for a people suffering from starvation, disease, and total cultural upheaval.
But the federal agents and military commanders on the reservations completely misunderstood it. They viewed large gatherings of singing, dancing Lakota as a precursor to a violent uprising.
So the military is sent to disarm the camp at Wounded Knee. The soldiers surround the camp and they bring in Hotchkiss mountain guns.
Hotchkiss guns were early rapid-fire artillery pieces capable of firing explosive shells. During the disarmament process, a scuffle broke out over a rifle and a shot was fired.
The military response was instantaneous and overwhelming. The troops opened fire and the Hotchkiss guns shredded the camp.
The sources estimate that up to 300 Lakota men, women, and children were killed. The bodies were left in the snow for days before being buried in a mass grave.
It is a profoundly dark moment, and textbooks often use it as the closing bracket for the frontier. They align it with the U.S. Census Bureau declaring the frontier closed in 1890. But if we look at the historical record, did the conflicts actually end there?
Not at all. The idea of 1890 as a clean ending is a historiographical convenience. The reality was a long tale of resistance extending deep into the 20th century.
The sources detail numerous armed incidents. In 1898, you have the Battle of Sugar Point in Minnesota involving the Ojibwe and U.S. infantry.
In 1909, federal officials used military force against the Muskogee Creeks in Oklahoma during the Crazy Snake Rebellion.
In the Southwest, there was the last massacre in Nevada in 1911. In Utah, tensions between the Utes and Mormon settlers resulted in the Bluff War and later the Posey War, which stretched into 1923.
Furthermore, elements of the Apache Wars, involving localized raids and military pursuits back and forth across the Mexican border, did not officially conclude until 1924.
The violence did not vanish just because the calendar rolled into a new century. And when we step back and look at the cumulative effect of these 3 centuries of conflict, the demographic toll is staggering.
The sources estimate the indigenous population in the areas comprising the modern United States was around 600,000 in the year 1800. By 1890, that number had plummeted to roughly 250,000.
The U.S. Census Bureau in 1894 attempted to quantify the specific casualties of the wars. They estimated that over a 100-year period, there were about 19,000 white settlers and soldiers killed, and roughly 30,000 Native Americans killed directly in combat.
Though they acknowledged the indigenous combat deaths were likely much higher.
But combat deaths are just the tip of the spear. How do we explain a population dropping by more than half?
It was a devastating synergy of factors. Combat was only one mechanism of destruction. The primary driver of the demographic collapse was Eurasian disease, smallpox, cholera, influenza striking populations with zero natural immunity.
When you compound those virgin soil epidemics with the systemic destruction of traditional food sources like the bison.
Yeah, and the brutal conditions of forced marches, like the Trail of Tears, the mortality rate skyrockets. The combination of disease, starvation, and warfare resulted in an absolute catastrophe.
Which brings us to the historiography. How historians interpret these centuries of conflict has shifted radically. For a long time, the dominant narrative was strictly focused on the heroism of American expansion, the pioneer conquering the wilderness.
But starting in the 1970s and 80s, the academic approach evolved significantly. The rise of ethnohistory, popularized by works like D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, centered the indigenous perspective.
Historians began analyzing the conflict not merely as a military conquest, but as a systemic dismantling of diverse societies.
And this leads to an intense ongoing debate within academic circles regarding terminology, specifically the use of the word genocide.
To be clear, we are reporting on our sources impartially here. We are not making a final ruling. We are explaining the academic discourse.
Right, the debate is highly complex. Scholars such as Jeffrey Osler argue that the policies and actions of the United States government fit the modern legal definition of genocide.
They point to the intentional destruction of food supplies, the forced removals resulting in mass death, and instances where local militias operated with extermination orders.
They argue these actions reflect a structural intent to destroy, in whole or in part, specific national and ethnic groups.
Conversely, other scholars dispute that classification. They argue that while the history is undeniably horrific, the United States federal government never formalized a singular, centralized policy of total extermination akin to 20th century genocides.
They argue the enormous population collapse was primarily driven by the unintended spread of disease, localized frontier violence outside of federal control, and policies aimed at cultural assimilation rather than physical annihilation.
Regardless of which side of that terminology debate a historian falls on, the factual record remains unchanged. It details a period of immense human suffering, profound cultural devastation, and the systematic reduction of indigenous land bases across the continent.
Which brings us back to our starting point. Looking at the history of the American Indian Wars is not like looking at a clean X-ray. It is navigating centuries of muddy waters.
It was a complex, brutal mechanism of expansion that involved shifting global alliances, predatory economic systems, and a devastating human cost.
And the complexity defies simple categorization. We are looking at overlapping layers of proxy wars, resource extraction, and existential survival, all compounding upon each other.
As we wrap up this exploration of the sources, here is a final thought to consider. It is very easy to look at the dates, 1830, 1876, 1890, and dismiss this strictly as ancient history locked away in the past.
But the legal architecture forged in the fires of these conflicts is still active today.
The treaties that were signed and broken, the established boundaries of the reservations, and the incredibly complex concepts of tribal sovereignty are not historical artifacts. They are living, breathing, legal realities.
They dictate modern Supreme Court cases, they govern water and resource rights, and they define the precise day-to-day relationship between Native American nations and the federal government.
The physical wars may have ended, but the legal foundation they constructed is the very ground we are standing on today.
It really is.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.